So first off, hi everyone. Welcome to our fifth end of work cycle update for stakeholders of Project Surfliner. We created these updates in response to stakeholder feedback that it would be helpful to hold a regular meeting at the end of every one of our development work cycles to share what the team has accomplished as well as what's coming next. And we really do appreciate you being here today. Our goal is to keep this meeting informative, but also concise. And whether you're joining us today or watching this recording, we appreciate your participation in the Surfliner project. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. This meeting is recorded, so please keep yourself muted if you're not speaking to help with the recording quality. And if you don't want to be in the video, you will want to turn off your video. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat as you think of them. However, in the interest of time, because we have a lot of content to get through, we'll wait to address those questions until the end, unless we can do it asynchronously during the chat. Next slide, please. All right, so just a quick agenda for today. This is a little bit different than our most recent end of work cycle overviews. We are going to start off with an overview of our most recent work cycle, which was focused almost entirely on Comet. And then Jessica and I are going to talk a little bit more about both the Comet development phases and also an upcoming communication survey. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tamsin and Gabriella to give us an overview of our last work cycle.
Do we have Gabriella?
I need to unmute, right? That would help.
Oh, I'm glad I chimed in. You must have been.
I was already at the end. I was going to turn it over to you, Tamsin, but no, I actually was thanking Chrissy and especially the stakeholders and our project team members for joining us today. And I hope everybody's managing to stay cool and focused. I know it can be challenging under these circumstances. So plenty of water, guys. So the next slide, please. The summer 2022 work cycle was comprised of 4 sprints. They were held from June 22nd through August 18th. And just as a reminder, Surfliner teams work in 56-day on and off cycles with 2-week buffers on each end. And while this entire work cycle was focused on Comet sprints, we did have one off-cycle Starlight sprint. That's our exhibits platform at the end of April. Next slide. And I think it's important to repeatedly ad nauseum recognize and congratulate our Surfliner teams, in this case, the Comet project team, on their stellar performance in meeting our set goals at this phase of development. And you'll hear more about that from Tamsin in a bit. People come and go, and since our last stakeholder meeting, we have had some people exit the team, but we are lucky to be able to say that Christian DeCastro from UCSD joined our Comet family recently. Next slide. And just as a reminder, Comet is our staff-facing digital object management platform. The user dashboard supports collaboration between users with an approval process through robust, configurable workflow controls. Comet serves as a central content management system, and any changes that happen in the system are pushed out to other public-facing discovery platforms. It is not a discovery tool, but rather it underlines another discovery layer. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tamsin to share with you the work cycle focus, what was accomplished. They will give you a little demo, and then they'll talk about what's next.
Thank you. Yeah, so I want to start by just thanking the project team for such great work this sprint. I'll say more about how great it was throughout this presentation and demo. But following Gabriella, I just want to do that early and often. Our key goal for the 4 sprints of this work cycle was to really establish a full deposit lifecycle for Comet content. So we had done some prior work on on ingest, file storage, metadata management, and workflow. And our goal was really to get all that ironed out into a process that we felt was pretty solid for both for individual object type content and for managing content in batch. And B, then to finish the integration ties for other platforms. And most notably, when we talk about other platforms, we're talking about other Surfliner platforms. So we have our IIIF endpoint, our OAI PMH service, and our geodata platform were key parts of the Surfliner stack that we wanted to integrate. I can say a little bit more about what our integration points look like in just a couple slides. Sorry, is somebody trying to chime in?
Hand sanitizer.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah, it's a fairly strong smell. So.
And then some other pieces that sort of fall into the bucket of that tight content lifecycle are being able to configure metadata per campus and have that sort of cascade out into other systems. Being able to run workflow and event triggered work. So I just want to say everything I'm talking about right now, I'll come back to in the demo. So it feels kind of abstract. That's okay. But running workflow and event triggered work like file characterization or generating access derivatives based on content lifecycle, and also sort of falling into that bucket is assigning permanent identifiers. So that was a bunch of work to try to take on in 4 sprints. There was a pretty large cross-functional project team working on this, and they did a great job of working on these various components. Those development goals involved many different components. Mainly what we'll see in demo is the comment web application, and that was really the focus of these work cycles, or of this work cycle and these sprints, but involved in getting content to sort of cascade out to other platforms. We had 2 other comment components, a metadata API, which we're code naming Super Skunk, and an event broker, which lacks a train code name because it's not really a software product that we're working on. It's sort of more of a commodity component that we're shipping. And then we also did pretty substantial work on the IIIF image server and an OAI PMH endpoint application, which we're calling Tidewater, that we sort of put in place as the most basic target for content publication that we could come up with as a good sort of rubber duck with which to test out that process. We also did work on the geodata platform Shoreline, but I'll come back to more of that as well. Okay, so this is just a diagram showing some of those components and really ending at the explicit comment development scope. Mainly, this is here just to help visualize how those things all work together. So the web application, we'll see the effects of the event broker and the metadata API, but not really them in particular. Okay, demo time. So this is our Comet staging site that has been running at UCSB for some time. We deploy Surfliner products into both campuses' infrastructure as part of our sort of proof that they can be deployed to both campuses. We do that continuously. So this is all up to date. I think the most recent deploy to this was sometime this morning. I'm gonna start by demoing content deposit. I'm just gonna make a new object. And let's name this one just test image. Why not? There's a lot of objects named test something or other in here. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do the puppies, even though they're not that compelling of a demo. So we've got puppies. We have various visibility options here. And then we did a whole bunch of work this sprint on this metadata. So this is UCSB campus specific metadata that's generated by a config. And I'm going to go ahead and add some fields here. Let's do, why not? Okay, so some metadata, and we added a file. Oh, it's interesting that it doesn't. Yeah, that's more what I'm expecting. Okay. So we saw that upload. I'm going to go ahead and add this object. We see the display, the metadata display, both the form and the display are derived from that metadata configuration. So one of the key goals for configurable metadata was to have it be something where if we want to change how the metadata is managed in a given deployment of this application, that's something that can be driven primarily by metadata professionals and not by the development team. If you hear my dog in the background, it's because somebody has just gingerly come to the door. Looking. So we attach this file. We're now running in the background some characterization processes. So if I click through on this file, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Then it's generated some metadata about that image. This runs using FITS, which is a file identification tool set. And it sort of checks what kind of content this is beyond the basic file extension kind of situation. So that's a background process that runs on ingest. And if I refresh this page now, I should see, yeah, so what the viewer looks like depends on what the kind of content is. So it sort of waits until that characterization runs. And then this is the image in a AAAF viewer. This is not a very, as you can see, it's not a very high quality image, but I can like zoom and pan here, and maybe I'll pop back to a different image that has more. Yeah, so this is a bigger image that I deposited earlier. And this is driven by the AAAF image server. So what's happening here is that the image server becomes aware of the new content and serves it out, and then the Comet platform sort of re-ingests or reconsumes it from there. So this zoom and pan capability is something that and that can be shared with other platforms, and in fact serves as the sort of main integration hook that we plan to support for the exhibits platform. Starlight So this is a really big piece of work that got done. There's a lot of components involved in making this this part possible. Okay, so that's zoom and pan. We saw file characterization. I want to show some of the nested content management. So Comet supports nested objects as deep as you want. We call them components. So this is a component test object. Oh, they look, I'm so creative in my naming. Let's find like a different, maybe I don't have a good image to upload that's bigger. I'm just going to do the puppies again. So I'll make this public too. And I can say this object. And if we go back to our original test object, our original test image, and we should see that it has a component now called component of test object. I think at some point along the way, the viewer should pick up that it has that component and embed the additional components in this viewer. And that's sort of a neat, like AAAF supports very complex objects and Comet supports very complex objects, and we have those things sort of glued together. Okay. I want to go ahead now and move us over to collections because I want to show the OAI publish feature that we worked on. And then we can move this object through a workflow, and I think that will be the bulk of the demo here. Okay, so I'm going to make us a collection. We'll call it, it's a user collection. We'll call it collection for demo. And let's add test image to the collection. There's a add to collection. Oh, uh-oh. I love when, oh. Well, we're just going to wait this out a second because I think that this isn't a problem. I think this is maybe this poor system just went down and came back up. That's a silly thing to have happen mid-demo, but there you go.
Bound to happen with a live demo, always.
It's sure to happen. This is a nice time to say that we're having right now a Devops Sprint in which one of the deliverables is going to be a high availability version of this stack so that it runs in parallel, and when it goes down, it stays up. But I think this is the expected behavior if it sort of like shuts down and restarts. I'm going to go ahead. That probably explains why we failed to load here as well. There we go, collection for demo. Okay, so we've now added this test image to the collection. And if I hit this publish collection button, then I should, let's go ahead and do that. Then I should see some new metadata show up on this test object page. to show the discovery links. So the idea here is that whenever Comet publishes something to a front end for public access, we're gonna make that link visible on this, we call this the show page. So I'm gonna go ahead and click through on that, and we can see the metadata here. A really big piece of work that got done this sprint or this work cycle was to make these platforms derive their metadata from the same config. So if that metadata professional driven process of editing the metadata schemas takes place, then that sort of cascades out to all the platforms. And new metadata becomes visible according to the configuration without any developer intervention. And that may sound like a small thing, but the process, I think, at both campuses for new metadata has always been sort of developer driven and expensive as a result. And this really offers a lot of promise in freeing the campuses from that. So this is a pretty simple, like, I've published this for metadata harvest, but if we look back at our diagram, a lot of the work that's happening here, so we pushed a button in the web app, and some work is happening between the web app and these two other systems to make this content visible in the front end. And that's that again was sort of like the big, can we get this delivered push for this work cycle, was figuring out all the pieces that need to get in place to do that integration. Okay, so that's content publish. We saw collections. I won't bother demoing it. This is just my old down page. I won't bother demoing it, but there is, in addition to having nested objects, you can have nested collections. You can move collections from one to another and so on. At this point, I think what I want to show is this workflow process. So the other big piece of the content lifecycle is once it's deposited into Comet, what is the process for reviewing and accepting that content? That piece is highly configurable as well. So we have a default workflow configuration in place where there's sort of a one-step review process where once the content is deposited, a person in a reviewer role can either approve it or request changes. And I'm both the depositor and the reviewer here, so it's kind of silly. I can also comment only. But if I'll just say that I want this to have a creator, then I should get a notification. I've got a lot of them dating back to 2021. But just now I've received a notification that says this object requires additional changes before approval. And I can click through on it. I'll go ahead and add a creator to satisfy myself. And I'll re-request review. So I added that creator. And I'll go ahead. And now I've received another notification that tells me that I am awaiting approval again. And I'll click through there and I can approve. In all my demos, I sort of treat this like I'm chatting with each other, but this is also sort of a workflow log. So it may be more functional in practice to use these comments to say like why this is being approved and why it's ready. Okay, so I moved this through the workflow. One thing that can happen as part of that configurable workflow process is that when an object moves from one part of the workflow to another, one step to another, work can happen. And in this default workflow, the main example of that is that as a result of approving this, I've assigned an arc to it, and that arc's now visible. Some work went into making sure that if I now send it back for more revisions, it doesn't try to assign a new arc. But that's how we're doing the permanent identifier management as part of the workflow process. So it's possible for the various campuses to decide at what stage for a given workflow those permanent identifiers should be assigned. I want to be a little conscious of time, so I think I'm gonna wrap the demo there and move on to key accomplishments. First of all, there were a lot of moving pieces for this work cycle, and the team did a really fantastic job of working on those in sort of large parallel throughput. Like we had many tens of changes going into our code base a day during this work cycle. And it was really just fantastic to see. I'm really excited about the IIIF image server and the integration that's provided there. Access control is driven by the content management in Comet. So if you make an object private, then it isn't visible to the public in the image server or an OAI PMH endpoint. And that was a big piece of work that we did. That OAI PMH publish was really the first example of the kinds of front-end integration that we want Comet to be able to do. We did that configurable metadata, the ARC assignment, the background jobs around file characterization. And then we also did a bunch of work on Shoreline workflow and metadata schema. But a big missed opportunity for us was that we had hoped to really have the Shoreline geodata ingest be tied in with Comet at the end of this work cycle, and that's still a work in progress. We did workflow design, but not implementation. There are some specialized file management requirements that Shoreline needs. So we saw components, but being able to sort of manage the relationships between objects and files very flexibly is something that we're still working on. And then there's some work to do to integrate Shoreline via an ingest script. The batch ingest and workflow support, which I sort of cut off there, is present, but sort of preliminary still. And then we had hoped to do automated derivative generation, and we sort of came into the work cycle very close to that, but left it sort of dangling even at the end. So that's something that we're hoping to continue to work on. The next steps for UCSB, we're doing local implementation planning, and there's some groups being put together to work on that. The bulk content ingest is something that that we're diving into using that preliminary support that we have. So we're hoping that actually ingesting content in bulk will drive the rest of the development on making that process more solid. On the UCSD side, there's interest in finishing out that geodata ingest work that we left undone, at least in some capacity, so that they can use Comet to drive their geodata ingest process sooner rather than later. On the broader Surfliner side, we're hoping for more feedback as part of that UCSB local implementation process, so that we can prioritize the backlog for the coming work cycle. And we're doing continued engagement with development in the Samvera community, and that's currently supporting embargo and lease functionality that is actually in this release, and I could demo for you, but sort of ran out of time. So engagement with the Samvera community is continuing to deliver new features to us. So we're still eager to be doing that. Okay, so right now we're running an off-cycle Devops Sprint, which will wrap up on the 13th. That again is focused in part on making the Comet platform more stable, so we don't see the kinds of blips that we just saw. But it also is involved in sort of load testing the various Surfliner platforms and paying off some technical debt. We're kicking off the next full work cycle in November. Because of the winter holidays and the timing, this is going to be just a short work cycle with just 3 sprints, and those dates are tentatively set through December 20th. So we'll be finalizing the products included in those sprints soon. And I think I'm now passing it back to Chrissy for development phase review.
Yeah, thanks, Tamsin. That was a great demo. And there's some really great questions in the chat. So I will try to be fast. So we have lots of time to answer those questions and anything else. Could you move to the next slide, please? So again, thank you all for joining us today. We put together this graphic because we wanted to communicate better about Comet's development path. And so this graphic is attempting to illustrate sort of the overall path that Comet development is on. And the really exciting bit about this past work cycle is, I think now that it is complete, that we are going to be able to move out of this initial development phase and into the local implementation phase. But before I talk about what that means, I do want to, since we have some new folks with us who were not here when we started the Surfliner journey, or even the Comet journey, I just wanted to quickly review where we started, and then we can talk a little bit about where we think we're headed. So we kicked off Comet development in early 2021 by gathering requirements and user stories from you all and a larger group of stakeholders at both UCSB and UCSD for a staff-facing digital object management system. And we had not selected Hyrax at that point. We really wanted to come to you all, get the requirements, and then those were developed into a formal feature list that we've shared out, and I'm happy to share that out again once I stop talking. So then we evaluated several potential platforms using an evaluation matrix, and then eventually we selected Hyrax as the basis for Comet. So our first actual formal development sprints with the Surfliner team began in March of 2021, and the overall goal of the initial development stage really has been to get Comet ready for local implementation and for content migration at both campuses. And like I mentioned at the end of this last work cycle, which wrapped up just a couple of weeks ago, and also our 17th Comet development sprint, we believe we have now reached that goal. So now during this upcoming implementation phase, we believe both campuses will begin working to configure our respective local instances and also begin our content migration. And this process is obviously going to look really different at each campus and is being managed by each campus team locally. And as you saw a few slides back, the next steps for UCSB are some local implementation planning is just kicking off. And we're also focused on some initial bulk content ingest, while over at UCSD, they're going to be working on geodata ingest. However, during this phase in general, we're anticipating that select stakeholders at each campus are going to use Comet, are going to begin to use Comet for managing local digital content, hopefully providing feedback back to the development team to help guide future work. We also anticipate there's the potential that we might need to start setting up some temporary integrations with legacy discovery platforms in order to persist access to content for users as we do sort of larger work on our respective systems. The time required for local implementation is likely to vary at each campus. And so we expect there's going to be some overlap between this local implementation phase and the continued development phase. However, during that next phase, you should expect that we'll be doing continued development on Comet, guided by that feature list and also ongoing stakeholder feedback. We also will be continuing to work on Comet integration with various discovery platforms, with preservation, etc. Each campus will also likely see continued configuration and content migration work. We both have lots and lots and lots of content. And in this phase 2, we'll probably start to see some decommissioning of some legacy digital library platforms. UCSB has a lot of those. At some point, we'll transition to what we label here as the full implementation phase. What this really means to us is that all the digital objects that should be managed by content are under Comet's management, and that any legacy platforms that were identified on local campuses for decommissioning have been shut down. You should really just imagine that this is a giant arrow stretching into the future, because this is really going to include ongoing feature development and integration work that's really guided by stakeholder feedback and needs. But I'm going to turn it over to Jessica in just a minute, because what it also means moving into this new local implementation phase is that the ways in which we communicate with you all are also going to need to be revisited. So unlike this past phase, right, where we were working against our initial feature list, and really what we were doing is like reporting out on our progress, and there wasn't really anything you could interact with. This new phase and all of the future phases really need to be very interactive, and we're hoping that folks can soon start to get into the system, depending on the role at your institution, and start interacting with it and providing feedback to us. And your feedback is really critical to us being able to deliver a platform that meets your needs. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to talk more about this.
Can I steal the screen, Chrissy? Is that possible? Maybe.
From Tamsin.
Tamsin, can I steal the screen?
I think so.
Thank you.
I
That
think
would
you
be
can steal the
awesome.
screen.
Okay. So what we've done is created a communication survey, and it is a fairly short survey just on the different communication channels that the Surfliner team uses to kind of gauge where is it being successful, where is it not, where are things falling through, and most importantly, where are you not looking so I can quit updating whatever you're not looking at. So just a reminder of our communication channels. This is a list from the blog. That's the surfliner.ucsd.edu blog. You can find it in About and then communication channels. We use the blog, we use Slack channels from UC Tech Slack. That's the hashtag Surfliner and the hashtag Surfliner-announce. We have a Google group, we have a shared drive, we have a YouTube channel. We share our code in GitLab, and then we have 2 meetings, the Surfliner Sprint Review meeting and the End-of-Workcycle Update for Stakeholders meeting. Chrissy, can you copy and paste the link for the survey into the chat? We will also follow up with an email with this link, so if you don't grab it before the end of the session, you can grab it later. But this is just a very short form on what is working and what is not, and any ideas that you may have for us on our communication of the progress of Surfliner and the products that we are building. And that is about it. I don't have a song to go with this one. I apologize. What do you want to do now?
Let's do questions. We have so many of those in the chat.
I love all the questions in chat. I want to answer some of them. Can somebody volunteer to sort of facilitate and re-ask the questions from
Sure.
the
I'll
chat?
do that.
Yeah.
I captured them. The first one came through via chat from Sybil, and this is probably for you, Tamsin. Sybil asks, what does Comet capture as fits output? Is it documented?
Yeah, so there's yes and no. I might be able to find some Samvera community level documentation for how the mapping works. But there's a mapping from the fits XML to an internal representation that gets stored. And maybe I'm going to either, Sybil, find some existing documentation to pass to you, or I'm going to open a ticket for us to create that documentation, because this is the exactly the kind of question that I love, because it creates new work for me. It'll be great to have something that's really firm in hand that that satisfies you about this.
That's great, Tamsin. Thank you. The second question is from Christella, and she would like to know, how do approvals work with batch uploads?
Yeah, I'm slightly hesitant to demo it, but but the short version is, if I do a batch upload, like say I upload a number of files through a CSV. So I've got a metadata manifest with CSV, and that links to files, and those objects get created as a batch. Then those objects technically have individual workflow states that are being tracked. But there's an interface in place that allows you to grab that batch that's been created together and move them through that workflow together. And we anticipate that that's sort of the normal way that people will do it on both campuses for most collections, that you might, say, review 20% of the items in a batch and then move the whole batch along, rather than individually click through the sort of cumbersome process that I demoed. But when I say that this is sort of still preliminary, what I mean is we have demoed that in the past. It's been now, I think, 6 months since we really worked on it. And the next step is really going to be for us at UCSB to try to do a real ingest using that process and iterate from there. So it's not something that I'm like thrilled about as the #1 thing that we want to demo here, but it does exist and you can do it. And I think it's just a little bit wonky and needs a little refinement from a real process. So the idea is that we'll do that sort of with the development team's hands-on it at UCSB, and then capture the refinements to make from there.
Thank you. The next question is from Christella as well. Christella wants to know, #1, what is the single use link? And I think she saw that when you were demoing. And is there an RDF view of the metadata in addition to HTML? What kind of reports will also be available out of the system?
Okay, so those are 3 different questions. I want to try to take them. I want to try to call on Chrissy to do the reports. Is that okay, Chrissy?
Uh-oh, I haven't been listening because I've been responding to Christella's, I'm sorry,
okay.
to Gabriella's
I've
question.
got it, don't worry about
Okay.
it. So first of all, yes, there is a RDF view. I'm not sure that we have dealt with the way that the M3 specification maps that. So I'm slightly, I think that I can go this is now live demo on very hard mode because I have no idea if this is going to work or not. Oh no, something went wrong. Okay. In theory, we can do web style content negotiation. So if I either send a request header asking for an RDF format, or I put an appropriate file extension on here, then I should get a result. But I think the code that generates that result isn't solid. I'm not sure that we have a ticket for that, and I'm going to go ahead and write down to make sure that there is one. So I'm gonna retract my yes and say that at present, no. The infrastructure of that sort of exists, and depending on how important it is, we could prioritize making that work again.
All right, so the single image link.
The single image link. Why don't we, as
Thank
long as
you.
we're here, why don't we try other things that I'm not sure whether they work or not? Oh no, okay, that doesn't. So this is a Hyrax feature that we haven't paid much attention to, but the idea is that even if a file is private, you might have a case where you want to provide it to a patron using some specialized request process. So then I can create single-use links, and you see they get little temporary identifiers, and pass them to the patron. And that patron expires either in 24 hours, or that link, the patron expires whenever they happen to. But the link expires in either 24 hours when I push delete. So if I decide that, oops, I didn't want to give that patron that link, or I sent it to the wrong person, then I can expire it, or or it expires the first time that it's used. I think it has to be used successfully. So this is just like, I want to make this object downloadable to a patron. I think there is a user story for this, but it hasn't been prioritized, and I'm not surprised that it's not working out of the box. So probably in a production instance, we'll either turn this feature off or iron it out, depending on how quick that is.
And last, in the dashboard, Tamsin, what are the reports that are currently being shown?
There's not a lot of really robust reporting. There is a analytics feature set yeah. So we can see a little bit like with the repository growth. The resource types and work types are not all that helpful. This is driven by the metadata. I think if I add a resource type metadata to each object, then this graph will show up. But all of our objects are generic objects, so this graph isn't all that interesting. There is a yeah, they're great. More something went wrong. There is an analytics feature set that we're not rolling out explicitly now because there's there's a really more complex set of analytics that we'd like to support and reporting that the two campuses really share. So I think it's going to be a later development cycle for us to get the analytics that we want, rather than something that's sort of like generic page view analytics. We think we have the infrastructure to do better than just like doing Google Analytics reports on what is happening in this management platform.
So, and I can chime in now that I actually went back and read the question, since I was not distracting myself, is that this is one of those areas that we're going to need stakeholder feedback on as we go to implement the non-out-of-the-box hierarchy, not the reports that we don't get out of the box with hierarchies. The one that I do know that came out in the user stories, partially, I know this is a pain point for me every year, and it's probably a pain point for other, is the annual UCOP statistics that we have to report back about all of our objects. We thought, wouldn't it be nice if Comet could just give us that information? So that's definitely on the list. I think that the more details that Tamsin was mentioned, that's going to be we need you to tell us what is going to be helpful. We can tell you, but what there is sort of out of the box, and we'll integrate it with our, as I understand it, it's compatible with both Google Analytics and Matomo. I'm not familiar with that one. Hopefully that answers your question.
All right. Sybil asks, how are events captured? Events such as creating, deleting, editing.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of different event stream feature sets that we have from a software standpoint. I'm guessing, Sybil, that you're asking mainly from an audit log kind of standpoint. Is that a fair interpretation? I'm seeing Gabriella nod, so I imagine that's true. I think
I'm getting in her brain.
I'm guessing Gabriella knows your mind.
Yeah, she just said
yeah. I think that's a set of features that we'd like to explore more the requirements of. There is some pretty limited event log. It's not premise compliant or Bravo compliant. Like there's not an explicit model that we're following for the auditability. But I think particularly around files, I'm going to go ahead and pop back over here. There is this here is being generated from a database capture of the various events that have happened to this file in particular, and things like the fixity check or version restores for this file would appear in that log. It's one of the things that I'm most anxious about, to be honest, about starting to ingest content in batch, is that since we don't really have a set of requirements that's really solid around what the event streams need to look like, that we're going to end up with some content that has less well kept event logging than if we ingested everything after we had organized that more thoroughly. But I don't think we do have a lot of explicit requirements captured for the event streaming, so it hasn't been something that we focused on very closely. That's my sort of hedgy answer to that, I guess.
And this is an example of Sybil being one of an ideal, maybe set to stakeholders where they do work with us to make sure that we're using the proper models for this. Last question is from Seth, and it's somewhat related. Seth wonders if they missed the Surfliner integration part. Is it integrating with digital preservation platforms at this point?
Let's pop back into slides for this one. Okay, so this is now the bigger version of the Comet or the Surfliner architecture as it exists today. Comet is sort of the big box at the bottom here, and that diagram is very similar to the one that you've just seen. And there's really a couple of really two different kinds of integrations that we're interested in. One is integrations to various services that once the managed content is available to the public in some way, or to members of the public according to access rules, that we then want to expose content in appropriate front-end systems. So the three, I guess there are 4 front-end systems that we really have worked on so far. Starlight, which we don't yet have thorough integration on, but I think that may be upcoming work cycle work. Shoreline, which we talked about the status of the progress on integration with that. Tidewater, which was, like I said, our sort of rubber duck example of how to get this integration working. And yeah, Shoreline is the geospatial platform and Starlight is the exhibits platform. Sorry about the internal team code naming. It facilitates our communication very well, but I realize that it makes it hard to talk about with other folks. And then the IIIF server is also one of these front ends that's a little more abstract, right? Like it's not a website that you can go to, but it's a set of services that we ship out to make images available with a complex feature set to both to our other platforms, but also people may be familiar that there are various IIIF image viewers that you can sort of deploy on other websites or use as independent standalone software to view complex content in IIIF. Okay, so the other piece here is the preservation piece, which you see at the bottom right. And that's definitely future scope, but we have a pretty good idea of how that preservation integration will work, inspired mainly by the output of the one-to-many grant that Sybil administered. Okay, I realize we're out of time. Thank you, Jessica. Is somebody tasked with wrapping this up? Or should I just say thank you to everybody for coming? We are available in Slack and so on to answer questions further. And please do answer Jessica's very nice survey.
We clearly like to talk about it. So if you have questions, please let us know and please take the survey. Thank you, Tamsin. That was really wonderful.
Awesome.
Great demo.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, great job, everyone. Thank you.
Stay cool, hydrate.